Okay, so tonight, no one needs to help Thomas Frank. Kansas City native who's made good in the wider world. He started life as a college Republican at KU, and he's returned to his roots with his latest book, Listen Liberal, which is a serious consideration of the problems that liberals have with inequality. And as a conservative Republican, it's good news to me. And if you don't believe that, and going back to my earlier comment about Donald Trump, you should read his latest column, which is a defense of the Donald Trump voter. Really, online, go to his website, a defense of the Donald Trump voter who's been attacked by Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times and the Huffington Post as being racist and stupid, and he says they're not stupid. And there is, I went to his website and I found this great quote, which I think is emblematic of the kind of thing that Thomas Frank has done as a commentator on American politics. And though I don't agree with a lot of his politics, a lot of his views on specific issues, I think as a cultural critic, he's one of the most incisive that we have. And he has this great, and this is aimed at Republicans, but I think also in Listen Liberal, there is similar commentary on the left and on the Democratic Party in particular. And it's really about our culture, not about a specific ideological position, but about our culture. And he says this, the backlash in American politics is a theory of how the political world works, but it also provides a ready-made identity in which the glamour of authenticity combined with the narcissism of victimhood is available to almost anyone. And I love that phrase, the narcissism of victimhood, because it kind of defines politics on both the left and the right, I think, in America today. We're all searching for what we can resent in American politics. That's true on both the left and the right. And it ends up where we've ended up in my party, the Republican Party, the lowest moment in the history of the Republican Party. And it has to do with the fact that we all know what we're against. We're against each other an awful lot. We all know what we resent in American politics, and it's hard to be for anything. Anyway, I think that's a brilliant aperçu of Thomas Frank. And as you know, What's the Matter with Kansas has become a classic on the left, a classic of American politics, and we're honored tonight, the third visit to the Kansas City Public Library of its author, Thomas Frank.
Howdy, folks. So here I am, it's 4 years and I'm back. Every 4 years, I come back and I do a book event in Kansas City. It was I guess 8 years ago now, it was 2008, so I had a friend who edits a newspaper in Paris, France, and he came over here, he flew into KCI, and we were gonna drive out to the Democratic Convention in Denver, and I took him to Plaza 3, and we did all this stuff. And then we drove out to Denver, and we took the 2-lane highways and this sort of thing. And he said, he comes over every 4 years, like me writing these books every 4 years. He comes over here every 4 years to go to our conventions and see how America is doing. He speaks very good English, and he interviews people wherever we go. And he says, I come over here every 4 years, and every 4 years it's a little bit worse. And he was right about that. I want to tell you an anecdote before I start about where the title came from. Now listen, liberal. It's supposed to have an exclamation point after it. And it came from, one of the sources of it. I was in Wichita some years ago, and I was staying in a hotel there, and I was supposed to do an interview with a newspaper reporter or something. And in the morning, and he showed up at my hotel and rang the phone in my room, and I picked it up, and he said, "Rise and shine, liberal." I always liked that. Anyhow. So you guys know I've written, I write these books about politics now, and I think this is probably the last one. I'm just so, I've had it with this subject, but for the last 16 years, I've written all these books about conservatism. I wrote 3 of them, 3 books about conservatism. And the one that's probably most familiar to you, the one about Kansas, the sort of theme of the book was the many ways in which the Republican Party roped in working class voters, all the varieties of fake populism that they're so skilled at inventing. And today, as we watch the rise of Donald Trump, the man who may be the greatest fake populist of all time, right? Seriously, this is, it's Huey Long without the compassion, sort of. But as we watch the rise of Trump, I want to talk about something that I hinted at in my book about Kansas, but that I didn't go into detail at the time. And it's just this, that a good helping of the blame for the right-wing backlash has to go to Democrats. I think that the degree to which the Republicans have won these voters over, the Trump voters, the white working class, the degree to which Republicans have won these people over is the same degree to which the Democrats have abandoned them. And so I think this is the year to ask, whatever happened to the party of the people? The party of the people, this is Jackson's term for the Democratic Party. That's who they were, going back to Thomas Jefferson. Now, I mean that question, whatever happened to the party of the people, I mean it in two ways. First of all, how did the Democrats come to abandon working people, middle class of this country? And in a related point, why have the Democrats failed, just completely failed on what I think is the greatest issue of our time? And what failure am I referring to? Well, President Obama himself has said, and I agree with him, that inequality is the defining challenge of our time. And you think about that statement for a second and you realize that, it's very sweeping, but it's not anywhere near sweeping enough. Inequality, I don't really like the word inequality. I think it's a euphemism. I think it's it doesn't really get at the subject. I think inequality is shorthand for all the ways, all the things that have gone to make the lives of the rich so much more delicious year on year for the last 3 decades. And also at the same time for the things that have gone to make the lives of working people so wretched and so precarious. Right? Inequality is this word, inequality, this euphemism. Inequality is the ever-rising cost of healthcare and a college education. Inequality is the coronation of Wall Street and the slow blighting of wherever it is that you happen to live. You catch a glimpse of inequality every time you hear about somebody that had to declare bankruptcy because their kid got sick, or when you read about the lobbying industry that drives Washington, D.C., or the requirement these days, the weird political requirement that all of our candidates either be billionaires' favorites or billionaires themselves, Inequality is about the way speculators and even criminals get a helping hand from Uncle Sam while the Vietnam vet down the street from you loses his house. Inequality is the reason that some people find such significance, such meaning in the ceiling height of an entrance foyer or the hop content of a beer, while other people will never believe in anything again. Inequality, I think, is a euphemism for the Appalachification of our world. Now, I know it's the Republicans who bear primary responsibility for this modern plutocracy that we live in, right? They're the party that launched us way back when on our modern era of tax cutting and wage suppressing, and they're the ones that made, a religion of the free market, and they fought so ferociously to open our politics to the influence of money at every level. I know all this, but, I've written about it, right? For years, but just blaming the Republicans and turning the TV set back to MSNBC, folks, it's not good enough, okay? It's not good enough, just getting back to that old partisan war. Because the things I'm describing, when we talk about inequality and what's happening to us as a nation, that we are coming apart, this represents a failure of the Democratic Party as well, right? Think about the Democratic Party that was around when we were growing up. Harry Truman, right down the road here in Independence, protecting the middle class society was their mission, right? They would have taken someone like Franklin Roosevelt take one look at the situation that we're in today and would have waded right into the fight, with relish. This would have been fun for them, right? Shared prosperity was this party's highest aim. Defending the middle class was this kind of sacred mission, and they never got tired of telling us about it. How they were defending the middle class, working people, all that. And it is true that, yes, to this day, Democrats are still the ones who always pledge to raise the minimum wage and the taxes of the rich. But when it comes to tackling the defining challenge of our time, many of our modern Democratic leaders falter. They acknowledge that inequality is rampant, that it's awful. They feel real bad about it. They cry big tears about it. But they can't find the imagination or the conviction to do what is necessary to reverse it. And instead, they offer us the same high-minded policy platitudes that they've been dishing out since the 1980s. They remind us, they say, hey man, there's nothing, look, it's really sad, but there's nothing anybody can do about technology. There's nothing anybody can do about globalization, right? And they promise us charter schools and job training, and they'll shovel out the student loans, all the student loans you want. But other than that, they got nothing. Let's look for a second at the issue of the Wall Street bailouts, which I still think are the Wall Street bailouts back in 2008 and 2009, which I still think are the great sort of historical inflection point of our time, the most significant issue of our young century, right? This is when everything might have changed, when the entire country could have changed course, but didn't. President Obama, remember, 2008, was elected in this massive wave of hope and enthusiasm, and then proceeded to continue the policies of the Bush administration, at least in regards to Wall Street, continue those policies essentially unchanged. No big banks got put into receivership. No bailouts got unwound. No elite bankers got prosecuted. Right? They prosecuted a lot of people who lied on their mortgage applications. They did that. FBI went after those people, but nobody at the top. Obama and his Democrats refused to change course when every sign was telling them to turn, when it would have been good policy to turn, when it would have been overwhelmingly popular to turn, when everybody in the country fully expected them to turn, including the Wall Street bankers themselves, and when it was fully within the president's power to take us in a different direction. What I'm saying here is that on this matter, there was no conflict between pragmatism and idealism. This is what Democrats are supposed to be voting on right now. Bernie represents idealism, Hillary represents pragmatism. Well, on this issue of the Wall Street bailouts, there was no conflict. The idealistic thing was also the practical thing, and the healthful thing, and the popular thing. It would have been good for the economy. Everybody wanted them to do it. And it was completely within their power, and they chose not to do it. Now, I know Democrats are the good guys, right? Or rather, the less bad guys. But it is not a coincidence that all the economic gains of this recovery that has been going on since 2009, all the economic gains of this recovery presided over by a Democratic president have gone to the already wealthy, the top 10%. And this is not, or I should say not only, because sinister Republicans are so diabolically clever and have thwarted the righteous liberal will. I know that Republicans are awful, and I know they're obstructionist, and I know they gerrymander, and I know they do every trick they can, right? Which politicians do. But what we've got here is a straight-up Democratic failure. Now, I use the word failure, but the right word for it is betrayal. And the history of this betrayal goes back a long way. When I was growing up here in Kansas City in the 70s and in the 80s, the Democratic Party used to be forever grappling with its identity, arguing over who they were and what they stood for. And this went on through the 70s, the 80s, up into the 1990s. You had all of these different factions in the Democratic Party. You had the new politics crowd that came out of the 60s. You had this bunch in D.C. that called themselves the neoliberals, and they were really into high tech. Silicon Valley, that kind of thing. And then you had another group called the New Democrats that were a collection of white Southern politicians. You had all these different factions fighting with one another, but what they agreed on one thing, and that was that the Democrats had to turn away from the legacy of the New Deal with its, old-fashioned fixation on working-class people. They disagreed on everything else, but they agreed on that. The New Deal had to end. And the man who brought closure to that long-running Democratic Civil War was, of course, President Bill Clinton, who brought a new kind of Democratic administration to Washington. And rather than paying homage to the old policies of Franklin Roosevelt, Clinton did these singular favors for FDR's old enemies, for the banks, the radio networks, the power companies, the bosses, basically. He deregulated Wall Street. And it wasn't just one act, it was a whole series of things all through his presidency, deregulating Wall Street. He ensured that derivative securities would be traded without any kind of supervision, thus teeing up both Enron and the financial crisis of 2008. And of course, he basically put an end to the federal welfare system that had been around since 1935. We can talk about that later in the question time if you want. Now here's a fact about Clinton's presidency that I didn't know until I started doing the research for this book, and it was kind of shocking to learn that in 1997, Clinton arrived at a secret deal with Newt Gingrich. And we always think of Newt Gingrich as his diametrical opposite, right? That these guys are complete, at loggerheads, hate one another. False. In fact, in private, they got along really well. They were from very similar sort of social backgrounds. They're both Southerners, all this sort of thing. But he arrived at a secret deal in 1997 with Newt Gingrich to privatize Social Security, which was, of course, the greatest achievement of Franklin Roosevelt. And it was a done deal, right? Gingrich had the votes. He was Speaker of the House. Clinton would sign it. They came up with a whole plan for how they would, step by step, how it would unfold, how they would do it, who would start it, what would the next step would be, how they'd set up a fake commission to, sign off on it, and this kind of thing. And Clinton even took the first step. If you go back and look at his State of the Union address in 1998, he talks about how we've got to, I think he said we have to save Social Security first or something, which was his way of announcing that they were going to, privatize it. And you know what happened the next day and completely stopped this? Monica Lewinsky. The scandal broke. That's right, exactly. And that was the end of that particular scheme. I think she's a hero. That's like, we should put her on a postage stamp, is what I think. Now, one thing you might remember about Bill Clinton, although so much of what he did in his time as president is forgotten because it's all blanked out by two things: the impeachment, the incredible fiasco, and then the good economic times. And so we can't really remember the sort of the nitty-gritty details of his presidency. But there's a funny thing: when he was running for president in 1992. He had this strategy as a candidate where he would go out of his way to insult or distance himself from some traditional Democratic constituency like labor or minorities, thus assuring the public that he was his own man. The most famous example was Jesse Jackson. Remember this? He set up a situation where he could basically insult Jesse Jackson to his face on TV. They called it the Sister Souljah moment. Do you remember this? Anyhow, the idea was, he proved that he was that he wasn't, that nobody had any control over him, and he was his own man. And he thought he could treat elements of his party this way because, remember the saying in those days, they have nowhere else to go. Right? What's Jesse Jackson and his followers going to do? Or become Republicans? Come on. And so this was the sort of genius of Clintonism, or that's what people thought back then. They thought this was genius. And what's funny is that when you study his presidency, you notice this campaign tactic becoming a full-blown philosophy of governance. This basically becomes his ideology, body slamming the people that just got you elected. And the great example here is the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. And you remember George Bush's dad, George Bush Sr., had negotiated the treaty with Canada and Mexico and couldn't get it through Congress. The Democrats were stopping it. And Bill Clinton did. He managed to get it through. He set up a war room, and Rahm Emanuel was there, and and they got it through, right? And everybody says, what a great thing. When he rammed that through Congress, though, think about it. He wasn't just insulting his friends in organized labor who opposed it so strongly. He wasn't just insulting these guys. He was conniving in their ruin, okay? He was materially assisting in the diminishing of their economic power. He was doing his part to undermine his own party's greatest ally and to ensure that corporate management would always have the upper hand over workers when they tried to organize or complain or protest about anything, because once NAFTA is signed, management can always just threaten to move the plant to Mexico, right? And sometimes even follow through on it, as we all know. So in passing NAFTA, in getting NAFTA through Congress and signing it, Clinton made the problems of working people, a lot of whom had just voted for him, he made their problems materially worse. Now, NAFTA is a fascinating chapter in political history because it's as close to a straight-up class issue as you'll ever see in American politics, and it gives you a real good idea of who our modern Democrats care about and whom they mean to please, right? Professionals and the rich were very much in favor of NAFTA, and working people, union members, middle-class people were very much opposed to it. People with graduate degrees, for example, were very pleased to learn that 283 economists had signed a statement declaring that the treaty will be a net positive for the United States, both in terms of employment creation and overall economic growth. Of course, that's not what happened at all. The predictions of the people who opposed the treaty turned out to be far closer to what eventually came to pass than the rosy scenarios of those 283 economists and President Clinton himself, who was talking about how many hundreds of thousands of jobs it would create. Anyhow, NAFTA, immensely destructive, but no matter. Bill Clinton's new Democratic allies regarded NAFTA as his finest moment. They would always say that his finest moment, this is a particularly brave act. There's a biography of Clinton that came out in 1996, written by the journalist Martin Walker. He was a British journalist, a good journalist, but he really liked Clinton. He admired Clinton. And he admitted in the book that Clinton had some failings here and there, but he said these were in the end balanced and even outweighed by his part in finally sinking the untenable old consensus of the New Deal and the crafting of a new one. So that's what his fans liked about Bill Clinton, that he killed the New Deal, that he set up a new consensus in this country. So this new consensus, let's talk about that. Here's the heroes of this new consensus. The same democratic thinkers that I described earlier fighting back and forth with one another all through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the people who kept advising the party to dump the New Deal and to dump the working class, these people had the answer. Who's the new coalition? Who's the heroes of this new consensus? What Democrats had to embrace, these thinkers would say, was the emerging post-industrial economy. And the people that the Democratic Party needed to identify with were the winners in this new order. Not the working class, not the middle class, the winners, the people at the top, the highly educated professionals who populated our innovative knowledge industries. What I mean by this is, professionals, lawyers, doctors, the math PhDs that write derivative securities, the biochemists that make prescription drugs. If you go back to the 1950s and look at the voting patterns, professionals were in the 1950s the most Republican group in America. This is the most Republican cohort. Today, or beginning in the 1990s, they are the most Democratic. They've completely switched from one side to the other. And that's who the Democrats are today. They are a party of the highly educated professional class. Now, they have other constituencies, to be sure. I live in Washington these days, or in the suburbs, and they talk about who's in their coalition. They talk about this all the time. They call it the coalition of the ascendant, and they mean minorities, women, and the young. But professionals are always the group that comes first. They're the ones whose technocratic outlook always prevails in the Democratic Party, and it's their tastes and their manners that are celebrated by liberal newspapers, artisanal everything, right? You know what I'm talking about. And it's their particular way of looking at the world that is always taken for granted by liberals as being, so objectively true. So what I'm saying is that professionals dominate liberalism in the Democratic Party in the same way that Ivy Leaguers dominate the Obama cabinet. And Democrats, by the way, this is all out in the open. This didn't require any real, difficult research to find all this out. They write about this all the time. They publish magazine articles. They write books about this stuff. And one of the things they've done over the years is they come up with these very flattering names for their new favorite group. They call these high-achieving professionals the wired workers who will inherit the future. They're supposed to be, this is my favorite one, a learning class. The learning class that truly gets the power of education. They're a creative class that naturally rebels against fakeness and conformity. They're an innovation class that just can't stop coming up with awesome new things. And of course, the leaders of the Democratic Party are drawn almost exclusively from the ranks of this same group. It's not a coincidence. I mean, look at the two most successful Democrats of recent years, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. They have these very similar life stories, and Hillary Clinton as well. But they have these very similar life stories where all of these guys were plucked from obscurity by prestigious universities. And look at Bill Clinton, right? So he grows up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and he goes off to Georgetown University. He becomes a Rhodes Scholar. He goes to Yale Law School, and the doors of the world sort of swing open for him. And the same with Barack Obama. He goes to Columbia, he goes to Harvard Law School, he's on the Harvard Law Review, and again, the same thing. The world opens up for him. And for these guys, the time that you spend at some really fancy university is what defines you as an individual. Look at their cabinet choices. Obama, in particular, it's all of them. These successful professionals whose worth is established by their achievement in college or graduate school. And Obama's cabinet, in particular, his inner circle is concentrated, very, very concentrated Ivy League graduates, usually both Ivy League undergrad and graduate school. The main exceptions are when they went to Oxford, in England. There's a whole bunch of them. So it is this shift, okay? So the shift that I'm talking about from the traditional working and middle class to professionals that I think, and this is the theory of the book, this is what explains so much of what is frustrating about our modern day Democratic Party. This is what explains, I think, this vexing problem of Obama and the Wall Street banks. I mean, why was it that the Obama team failed to do what needed, so clearly, so obviously needed to be done with these banks, what the public was crying out for them to do? Why did they fail? Why did they go out there and declare that Wall Street executives were going to be held to a different legal standard than other Americans, which they basically did? Why did they choose Wall Street over average people again and again and again? And we can talk about all the examples of this in the question time if you want. But there's an explanation for it. And my explanation is that because for the achievement-conscious people who filled the Obama administration, investment bankers, these Wall Street guys, these are not just friends. These were classmates. These were they themselves, right? The two groups are the same. They go through this revolving door, they go in and out. People go, back and forth into the administration, out of Citibank, whatever. There is no difference. Wall Street is filled with these people of subtle minds, sophisticated jargon, and extraordinary innovativeness. They're exactly the kind of creative individuals that Democratic Party theory tells us we have to honor and respect, right? They're making these financial instruments that are so admirably complex. Is Bill Black here today? Do I see him? I don't see him, so I'll tell you an anecdote. Okay. No, he would tell it if he was here, but he's not here. Back in the day, bank regulators used to, when they would, in the old days, when a bank regulator would see undue complexity, coming out of a bank, that's a red flag. There's something going on. That's fraud. or it's not necessary, but it's an indicator that there's something going wrong. For our modern day Democrats in the Obama administration, it's the opposite. That all that financial complexity, what does that mean to them? It means sophistication, right? Somebody's got an advanced degree. It's like financial rocket science, as an Obama administration official once said. And he said this, by the way, when he was explaining why they weren't prosecuting these guys. Because it's financial rocket science. You can't do anything about that. And it's exactly the same for Big Pharma, right? They love Big Pharma, so innovative. You can't sign a treaty that will, import generic pharmaceuticals from India or somewhere. No. You have to protect this creative industry. And megadittos for Silicon Valley, right? This is an industry that in democratic eyes can do no wrong, except for this recent business with Apple and the FBI. But they're going to get over that. That'll be gone, and they'll get back to normal in time for the election, right? I mean, Silicon Valley, these people are so lovable, so professional, so creative, that for these guys, basically, enforcement of our country's antitrust laws has essentially been suspended, right? As Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton used to travel the globe talking about something she called internet freedom. And what she meant by that was that access to certain Silicon Valley servers was a basic human right. That was our foreign policy in the Obama years. So what does a party of the professional class look like? What does it believe in? Now, the most important item in their ideology, it's so important that they take it for granted. It's not even like visible, right? It's like air. But the most important item in the democratic ideology is meritocracy. The idea, the conviction that the successful deserve their rewards and that the people up on top are up there because they're the best. And this is the first commandment of the professional class, meritocracy. But I'll tell you something about meritocracy. It's not a very good way of tackling the problem of inequality, right? This is not a doctrine for mitigating inequality. This is a doctrine for rationalizing inequality, right? Everybody gets what they deserve, and what they deserve is defined by how they did in school, right? So you got straight A's? Yeah, of course, you're going to be doing really well. That's awesome. You didn't finish high school? You should be picking up cans by the side of the road. That just makes perfect sense. What I'm getting at is this, okay? And this is the sort of core idea of the book. There is no solidarity in a meritocracy. It's the exact opposite idea. Professional class leaders show enormous deference for one another. The people at the top of the professions, that's almost the definition of professionalism. They show this extraordinary deference and respect to one another, but they feel very little sympathy for the less fortunate members of their own disciplines, right? When one of their colleagues at a big pharma, or something gets fired, they don't go out and protest or go on strike or something like that. And I'll tell you a story. So I am, of course, a member of the professional class. I got a PhD once. Back in the 90s, I went and got a PhD in history up in Chicago. And when my generation of historians and people that studied literature and all the other humanities, when we got out on the job market, we discovered a funny thing. There were no jobs anymore. It had the market for academic labor had been casualized, Uberized, if you will. And the only jobs out there was no more tenure track jobs, basically, or they were a very, very tiny number. The only jobs left were working as an adjunct. You know what this is? This is when you teach a class. just like a regular professor, you teach a class, you work hard, you grade the papers, you show up 3 days a week, you work hard, and you get like $1,500 a semester. So it's better than that now. That's what it was when I got a PhD. And I'll tell you something. The funny thing about all this was happening, and our elders in all of these disciplines that I just described didn't give a damn. You know why? Because there is no solidarity in a meritocracy. When that life doesn't, they look at you and they're like, well, you didn't make the grade. Well, too goddamn bad, that life doesn't shower its blessings on people who, don't get all A's is not a shock or an injustice. It's the way things are supposed to be in a meritocracy. So let's look at this from the happy point of view, okay? I'm a real downer these days, and I know it, and we'll talk about the hopeful side of this later, but okay, there's a happy side here, right? This is the story of Listen Liberal is a happy one. It's the gradual, think about it, it's the coming together of money and merit, of righteousness and success. This is the marriage of finance with political virtue. And virtue and righteousness are what being a liberal is all about these days. That's what we deal in. You know that, right? That's the commodity that's for sale. But in another sense, the transformation of the Democrats has been this is just a disaster. Think about it this way. Left parties all over the world were founded in order to advance the interests of working people. That's why they exist. But our left party here in America, one of our two monopoly parties, by the way, our left party has chosen over the last 30 years to turn its back on these people's concerns, on the concerns of working people, and make themselves instead into the tribune of the enlightened professional class, the creative class that makes these innovative things like derivative securities and smartphone apps. And the working people that the Democrats used to care about, they figured they had nowhere else to go, in the famous Clinton era expression. Well, folks, they have found somewhere else to go. And by abandoning them, Democrats have made inevitable both the economic desolation of this country as well as a populist backlash against liberalism that has been building slowly for decades. And 10 years ago, I wrote about it in my home state of Kansas. But today, it is all over the country, right? The backlash is everywhere now, swarming up out of the deindustrialized zones and screaming these bizarre, Trumpian slogans. Now, think about the choice that's going to leave us with this year. If everything goes like it appears to be going now, and our candidates are, we have the two candidates that it looks like we're going to have, think about where that leaves us, right? Angry, Trumpian intolerance on the one hand, and on the other, meritocracy forever, right? Folks, there has got to be a better choice. Thank you very much.